Thank you so much, Ben, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to journey forward with our exploration of the Imahot, or the Matriarchs. And we'll be focusing today exclusively on Rebecca, who in a lot of ways is one of the more prominent, or perhaps even the most prominent of the matriarchs. In our final session next week, it's going to be a really jam-packed session with 4 explorations crammed into 1 hour. So get ready for that. But today we're focusing exclusively on Rebecca. Next week we'll be talking about Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. And the way that today is going to work is that I am going to present more frontally. I am not going to be reading the source sheet that Ben referenced inside. When I say inside, what I mean by that is I will not be reading word for word. I will be presenting the content. If you would like to have the text in front of you or for your own time, absolutely, please do that. Please read along as I'm speaking. And as Ben mentioned, I will be pausing a little bit throughout the session for comments. We ask that those be submitted through the chat box. So just if you have any comments or questions or thoughts, please just throw them into the chat, and I'm looking forward to engaging with them. So we are continuing from last week, where we explored Sarah through modern Midrash predominantly. This week, we're going to take a very different approach. We're going to focus pretty exclusively on the biblical texts that talk about Rifka, or Rebecca. I will be making a few references to a book by Wilda Goffney called Womanist Midrash, which is a fascinating exploration of the women of the Tanakh through the perspective of a very Jewishly literate Black Episcopal womanist theologian. So if that is something that is of interest, it's called Womanist Midrash. I am going to be referencing it on the side, but our main focus today is the biblical text. So there are 3 instances, I would say, in Sefer Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, where we get to meet Rebecca in various iterations of her life. We don't know anything about her childhood. We know that she is the daughter of Bethuel and Milcah, who Milcah is the wife of Nahor, and Nahor is Abraham's brother. So that is an interesting thing to mention. In her story, in Genesis 24, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, she refers to herself as the daughter of her mother several times, which is a really interesting appellation, particularly because we don't often see that. And as Dr. Goffney talks about in her book, it is a really important remembrance of the fact that Rivka, that Rebecca, is very much connected to her matriarchal line. I think that's also significant because next week, we will be talking about Leah and Rachel, who are the daughters of Lavan, who is Rivka's brother. So we're really staying in that maternal lineage. So we get to know Rifka when Abraham's servant, Eliezer, who I don't believe is actually named in the actual shot of the text of Genesis 24, is asked by Abraham to go and find a wife for Yitzhak, and specifically not to find a wife for Yitzhak from the women of Canaan, where they are, but rather from Padan Aram, where he is from, which is many, many kilometers away. So imagine that there's a very lengthy journey, and Abraham has this whole formula that the woman has to say, you know, please drink and I will water your camels. And if she fulfills these different things, then she's the right wife for Yitzhak. And if you aren't able to find a wife for Yitzhak, then you are excused. Like if you're not able to find a woman who fulfills those things, then you are excused from finding a wife for Yitzhak. Eliezer reports the story a little bit later on in a different way, which close readers of the text may have noticed. But we get to meet Rivka in this context where she is determined to be the wife for Yitzhak. She comes out to draw water in the evening when Eliezer and his entourage arrive at her home. She then gets jewelry, some bracelets and a nose ring, and Eliezer introduces himself. and talks and asks if there's places for him to stay for the night. And Rivka explains who she is, that she is the daughter of Bethuel and Milcah. And she goes to her home and introduces this new arrival. And Eliezer and his entourage then go into the home and meet Lavan, Rivka's brother. And eventually, Eliezer says, "Can I please have Rivka's hands in marriage for my master Yitzhak?" And the response is, "We'll let her stay with us, for the next 10 days or so before she actually consents. And we have to get her consent," which I think is a really interesting piece there. Actually, it's from this particular text that in Jewish law, women have to consent to marriage. And when it is asked of Rivka, "Will you go with this man?" she says, "I will." And eventually, she and her maids and her nurse Devorah, who gets mentioned a little bit later on as well in the text, mount their camels and they go with Eliezer back to Canaan. And then there's the very famous scene where Yitzhak is, the JPS translation says, walking in the field, but others often understand sichud to be talking about praying or meditating in the field. That is, as a side point, that is why traditionally Yitzhak is understood to have created the mincha or afternoon service. So they travel, and I imagine it's weeks of travel. They get to Canaan. Yitzhak is in the field, davening, meditating, whatever we want to use there. Rifka encounters him, covers her face with a veil. There's not much known about the wearing of veils in early biblical Israel, but that is an important note. And she falls off her camel upon meeting Yitzhak. And there's something really interesting in the fact that this is a marriage that it's the only marriage in the Torah, to my knowledge, that is a monogamous marriage. Because the end of that particular chapter says that Yitzhak took Rivka into his tent and loved her and was comforted after the death of Sarah, his mother. And there is this notion of love truly existing between Yitzhak and Rivka. We don't know how old Rivka was. The Midrashim have various ages. Some of them are a bit challenging for the modern reader, including there is a tradition extant in the Midrash, which we are not going to go into today, that says that Rivka was a child. That is, I do not believe that that is aligned with the pshat of the text, but there is that idea. But in any event, we don't know anything about Rivka's childhood, but we know that she is a woman who, in this moment of marriage, expresses agency. And if we kind of step back a moment from this narrative, it's a really interesting narrative. I mean, I'm trying to imagine myself in Rivka's position, which I think as moderns, we need to be careful to not project our own perspectives onto the text. But you have this man coming, saying, "I have this request from my master to find a wife for his son Yitzhak," and Rivka just goes. Though she makes that decision, it's hard to imagine, did she know what she was going to be getting herself into? Was this the right road for her? What was it going to be like for her to leave her home and go hundreds and hundreds of kilometers away? Thinking about the speed of travel, it certainly took a substantial length of time to do that. But we have a very fleshed out experience of Rivka as a woman exercising agency within the confines of her social and cultural position. We have a woman who is very, very kind from the outset. And I mention that because the third source that we're going to talk about with Rivka presents her in a bit of a different way. And she is a woman who certainly has a sense of self within her family unit and is very clearly connected in a deep way and is very clearly a person of prestige and privilege within that system. So putting that all out there, it isn't surprising that she is in a lot of ways one of the most prominent and important matriarchs, though all of them, I would argue, exercise agency. We'll talk a little bit about Bilhan Zilpah and the complications around that next week, but by and large, they are exercising agency within particular social and cultural positioning. And by doing so, tradition really understands that they are giving us gifts as a Jewish people that we then carry forward. So if we bracket that, we move into Genesis 25, and we have the Torah tells us that Rivka was not able to conceive, and that Yitzhak prays on Rivka's behalf. Now, we don't know if this is the only time that Yitzhak prays for Rivka. Where is Rivka when this is all happening? How is she experiencing that? But in any event, Yitzhak prays for Rivka because Rivka has not conceived, and she does conceive, and the twins are very active in the womb and are struggling and causing her a lot of physical distress. And I imagine that folks in this call who have carried children can probably imagine fetal activity happening in this moment. And the distress is so intense that Rivka says, very famous line, she goes and searches or seeks the divine, searches after God, and says, Im kain lama ze anochi, which the JPS translation says, if so, why do I exist? If I'm dealing with this struggle and pain, why do I exist? Another way to think about that is, if thus, im kain, if thus, why me? Why is this something that I am bearing? What is this here to tell me? And she learns that she is carrying two nations, one mightier than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger, which, given where we are in our Parsha cycle, I think is a really interesting thing to note, because in this week's Parsha, we encounter the reconciliation, or perhaps partial reconciliation, of Esav and Yaakov. But in this particular moment, in Genesis 25, we have the foreshadowing that Rebecca is carrying twins. One will be mightier than the other, and the other will serve the younger. So the twins are born, and the first one comes out red and hairy. He is known as Esav because of that, as Esau, and then holding on to his heel is his brother Yaakov, which comes from the Hebrew word for heel, Ekev, because he's holding on to the heel of Esav. We also learn that Rifka favored Yaakov, the milder, the more gentle of the two siblings. Yitzhak favored Esav. So again, we have the thread of Rivka's agency. Rivka is bold when she encounters Eliezer and his entourage, goes and explains who they are, accepts the marriage proposal, is clearly loved by Yitzhak, and then expresses a particular preference for one of her children. So without making any moral judgments or claims about what all that means for Rivka, I think it's just important to mention that and to note that the thread is continuous. And the final source really draws that to a, I wouldn't say close, but perhaps like a particular high mark or high point, in that we have the very famous episode in Genesis 27 of the deception of Yitzhak. So Yitzhak is getting old, and he has become blind in old age, and he doesn't know when he's going to die. And he says to Esav, please get me game and make me a dish that I like so that I can bless you with my innermost blessing before I die. Rivka overhears this conversation, brings Jacob, into her presence and says, I overheard your father speaking to Esav. He doesn't know when he's going to die, but he's ready to give Esav his innermost blessing. So you may notice in all of this that there is this binary. One blessing, one favored brother, one woman to carry on the covenant, in this case, Rivka. There's a very particular wife for Yitzhak, that despite the fact that Avraham had Yishmael and many other children from Keturah and a few of his other wives that he took after Sarah's death. So he's got many descendants, but the Torah is reminding us again and again and again of this binary. One son carries on the covenant, one particular wife for the son, although of course we'll see next week that that gets broken because Yaakov is anything but monogamous. And we have this continuation of the idea, two twins, both sons of Yitzhak. Only one of those sons of Yitzhak is in fact going to carry forward the covenant, although both Esav and Yaakov bury Yitzhak in the cave of Machpelah. So that is a really interesting side note. They seem to come together for that, but in terms of the bracha and in terms of the covenant, it can only go through one of the two twins. So Rivka, who has already made it plain that she favors Yaakov, says to Yaakov, I heard your father say to your brother Esav, get me game, make me a meal such that I like, so that I can give you my most inner blessing before I die. And Yaakov is then instructed by his mother, go fetch me kids from the flock. I will make food that your father likes, and you will go in place of your brother Esav and get your father's innermost blessing. And Yaakov, who at this point has already tricked Esav once by stealing the birthright, or by getting Esav to sell the birthright in a moment of tremendous despair for Esav. He's clearly famished, and at that point is saying, well, I'm near death. What does it matter if I have this birthright or not? Which that's an interesting piece of text as well to name. Yaakov says to Rifka, well, but if I do this, my father's going to know that I am a trickster. And Rifka says, do as I say, pretty clearly and sternly. So Yaakov goes, gets the kids. Rivka makes the meal for Yitzhak. Then Rivka gets Esav's best clothes. So here again, Rivka is still exercising agency. She is getting the best clothing that belongs to Esav, dressing Yaakov in that clothing. So clearly is masterminding this entire undertaking. I'm going to skip over what happens. Yitzhak ends up giving his most innermost blessing to Yaakov, realizes that he has been duped. Esav cries a bitter cry and says, when the days of my father come near, when the days of mourning for my father end, I will kill my brother Yaakov. Rivka, again overhearing this, says to Yaakov, you'd better get out of here. Your brother is furious with you. He is planning to kill you. Go to my father's house, which again I think is important. She's saying, go to your maternal lineage, go to my father's house, and where my brother Lavan is, and find a wife there. And that then launches Yaakov on his journey. Another piece that I think is important to mention, which is just kind of a side note, but before the incident with Yaakov and the deception of Yitzhak, it is mentioned that Esav, when he's 40, takes 2 Hittite women to become his wives. And this is a source of grave distress to Rivka and Yitzhak. So yet again, Rivka is making her opinion known in this situation. And I'm presenting this as neutrally as possible because I think it's important to not make moral judgments. It's very easy for us to, and if one believes that the Torah speaks to us eternally, there's a lot that we can, of course, take from every narrative. But it's important to talk about Rivka as the multifaceted character that she is. There are a lot of questions that emerge for me about Rivka. We don't know anything about Rivka's childhood, as I said before. We don't know anything about her marriage to Yitzhak other than that it was supposedly or apparently a monogamous union, that there was love between Yitzhak and Rivka, and that there were 20 years where Rivka was unable to conceive. And we deduce that because the Torah says that Yitzhak was 60 years old when the twins were born. We again do not know how old Rivka was in that moment. Yet, clearly, from the time that between the birth of the twins and their childhood, in which we learn that Yaakov is a mild man and Esav is a hunter and goes out to the field, clearly something has gone awry. We don't know what that is. There are plenty of things that it could have been. I imagine that Yitzhak was quite traumatized after the near shechting that he experienced, after the near sacrifice that he experienced. Perhaps the marriage didn't go as well as we might have liked it to, but whatever it is, Rivka feels a deep desire and a deep obligation, I would argue, whether it was right or not, to ensure that the bracha that her husband is going to give to her son to continue the lineage and the covenant is given to Yaakov, not given to Esav. There is a very interesting book called Esau's Blessing, what the Bible can teach us about people with special needs, by Dr. Ora Horn-Prauser. And in this book, she engages in several close readings of biblical text to put forward the idea that there are prominent biblical personalities who have what we might call today disabilities or learning differences or mental health conditions. Now, whether in fact that is true, I don't think is the point. I think the point is an exploration of the possibility as a means of finding oneself in text. I would put Dr. Prauser's work in the long tradition of, or the, I shouldn't say long tradition, but the esteemed tradition of modern Midrashim, because she is making a claim that a biblical character may have experienced a particular way of living with disability, though we don't actually know if that's true, and it's not presented as an absolute. It's not presented as this is clearly the way it had transpired. Rather, it is presented as if Esau had ADHD, which is Dr. Prauser's claim, it might account for Rivka's insistence that the bracha go to Jacob. We don't, again, know that. This is not about acquisitional knowledge. This is about exploration. Whether that is the case or not, I'm going to put that aside. I wanted to just simply introduce that as an option on the table. It's not one that I personally subscribe to. I'm going to put my particular view on the table. I don't think it's a particularly helpful exploration because I think that we need to be very careful around diagnosis of people who are no longer alive and haven't been for millennia, particularly because the way we understand disability today is vastly different than the way disability was understood even 50 years ago, frankly, even 20 years ago. And so I think we should be very, very wary. And at the same time, it does open the question, why was Rifka so assured and insistent that the covenant needed to go through Jacob? I don't think we can ever definitively answer that. Classical Midrash has a lot as well. The commentaries, there are lots of different perspectives. We might open it up later on to that larger question. But whatever the case may be, Rivka is clearly exercising agency in her own way and is clearly making it plain to her son Jacob that he is to follow her directive. And he does. And I think that that is significant. She is taking her place and making her claim. Whether that is a claim that was just is, in my view, pretty clear that it was not just. However, that aside, that is not the point. The point is that she is making herself an agent in her family's continuation and in the way in which the covenant will continue. And I think we'll see this next week with Leah as well when we talk about the Mandrakes. Leah is exercising agency in that instance. And Leah, of course, is coming from the same background that Rivka did. And that, I think, is an important piece to always bear in mind. So if we back up to the incident where Rivka is carrying Yaakov and Esau, and she is experiencing a lot of activity and is wondering what's going on, and it's causing her a lot of distress. And she says, if so, in Cain, lamazanochi, and goes and seeks after the divine. That in and of itself is a deeply spiritual moment. It's perhaps a moment of prayer, a moment of pleading, a moment of deep introspection and wondering what's going on. Why am I experiencing this? She is a very, very active character. And that is often juxtaposed to Yitzhak being perceived as very passive. In the commentaries, especially when we're reading Parshiot Chaye Sarah and Toldot, which are the two Parshiot that Rivka really features prominently in, there is often a juxtaposition presented between the active Rifka and the passive Yitzhak. I think that both of those can be complicated. As I've said now a couple of times, Rivka certainly is a very active character, yet, as is true for all of us, she is defined by the situation she finds herself in. Yet, she does not accept it as it is, but really takes it upon herself to act in a way that she feels is fitting and befitting. And so too, though Yitzhak is often acted upon, he too, in many ways, is active and participatory in his own life. And I'm so curious, and again, we will never know, and this is one of the beauties of Torah study, because as Ben Bagbag says in Pirkei Avot, turn it, everything is in it. We're never going to have a deep insight directly into the relationship between Rivka and Yitzhak, or between Rivka and Esav, or Rivka and Yaakov. But what we do get is a really honest and unfettered portrayal of a family that is interwoven on so many ways, and a family that is experiencing a lot of interlocking trauma and a lot of interlocking dysfunction. How do we interact within that context? And how does our own position factor? So because these narratives continue and the repercussions continue for a long time as Bereshit continues forward, I think this is a really interesting exploration for us to engage in terms of Rivka's story, in terms of who she was, what role she played, and how we today perceive her, as well as how the tradition perceives her. The tradition really perceives her as the paragon of kindness because of the way that she interacts with Eliezer and his entourage. So we can take that gift of chesed, that gift of kindness, that gift of abundantly overflowing kindness, which we also get from Abraham, as well as thinking about the role that she played in the masterminding of the deception. I'm going to pause here. I'm going to now open it up if folks want to place any comments or questions into the chat. We're just going to give a few moments for folks to do that.
So a couple of questions and comments have trickled in. Give me just one second here. So somebody noted the relevance of the disability issue is that Esav is described as wicked. I never understood why. I like the exploration of how Esav's not being studious and intellectual means in Jewish tradition that he is wicked.
Oh, I want to pause there. Thank you for that. I would love to address that just for a moment. The other thing about Esav, so in terms of the disability piece, I want to be very clear. I am not in any way an expert in either intellectual disability or ADHD. I have no direct or indirect experience with either. So I am always urging a lot of caution when it comes to thinking about disability vis-a-vis our biblical ancestors, except when it is directly mentioned. That is my personal intellectual and pedagogical perspective, because I think it's really important to stay close to the text. So I offered that reading as an exploration that Dr. Prauser offers, but I also want to mention that the juxtaposition of Esav as wicked throughout the tradition is one of those very challenging bits, because he gets associated with Edom. I mean, that is directly in Sefer Bereshit itself, that he is the father of the Edomites. Actually, at the end of this week's parasha, we have a lengthy litany of all of Esav's clans and their descendants and where they settled. The Torah loves to give us those chronologies, and those are, I think, really exciting and important. But we learn from that Esav is the father of the Edomites. Edom was eventually understood by the rabbis as Rome. And I think it's important to name there that at that point, after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, after the destruction of the temple, the Romans occupied the land of Israel in a very deeply interesting way. And I want to name that, of course, that is a complicated thing to get into. We're not going to talk so much about that, but I mention that because at the time of the Talmud, in the time of rabbinic literature, the rabbis were living in a deeply powerless context, and as such, were very eager to ascribe anything that they were struggling with to Rome. And they very conveniently link Rome to Edom, which is already linked to Esav. So just as a bit of a mention around that, and I'd love to take any other comments that arise.
We have a couple more trickling in, Lauren, so you can just cut it off whenever you feel we can move on.
Okay, but, I'll take a few at a time.
Okay. So here's a question. Why would Rebecca trick Isaac? I think she means trick, the questioner means trick Esav, rather than reveal that God told her Esav would serve Jacob. Arthur observes that Esav's cry, "Have you no blessing for me?" is powerful. Did Rivka have any compassion for Esav? And I'll give you one more, Lauren, before you go on. From Paula, Esav's story is an interesting parallel with Ishmael's story. Isaac loves his brother, and perhaps the missing of his brother leads him to favor the son who reminds him of Ishmael.
Paula, I love that. I think you are absolutely correct. And I think it is so important for us to lift up those stories. Esav and Yishmael are extraordinarily parallel. I hadn't really thought about that, but Yishmael very directly is mentioned or is talked about as someone who is a very active person. He is someone who is very, I believe he is also a bit of a hunter. I mean, I would want to go back and check that. I don't want to say that directly, but he is certainly someone who is portrayed in the shot of the text as someone who is very engaged, though we don't actually ever hear directly from Yishmael, which I think is really interesting because Yishmael is, in Hebrew, Yishmael, God will hear. And so to the question about the line of, "Have you no bracha for me, Avi? Have you no blessing for me, my father?" that Esav cries. I mean, I imagine that in my mind, and it is so piercing and heartbreaking and poignant. And I think about Yishmael, and I think about Esav, and how they are part of the mishpacha. They're part of the family, but yet the text is saying there is one line that continues. And what does that tell us about our own families? And what does that tell us about the ways in which we ourselves maybe are creating situations in which members of the family feel more outcast? I can imagine that many of us in this room have either experienced that directly or indirectly in our own family. What does Sefer Bereshit teach us about what to do and not to do in terms of our own goings on and our own showing up in the world? And then to the question of Rifka and Esav, Rivka and Esau, why doesn't Rivka just say to Esau directly, God has said to me, or I have this notion that I need to tell or have the bracha go through Jacob? I don't know. I've been wondering about that that is a question that is very much on my mind. Actually, it's very fortuitous that we're talking about Rivka this week, because in the Daf Yomi cycle, on the day that we are learning together, we have just begun Masechet Ta'anit, and I know that my Jewish learning, we've been all learning together since the beginning of this cycle. And in yesterday's daf, on yesterday's page, there is direct mention of Rifka though they don't talk directly, I believe, about this particular incident, but there is direct mention of Rivka and the role that she plays going forward. And so I do think it is really interesting to think about how she is portrayed, why she doesn't just directly communicate with Esau and say, you know, I really have a strong sense that the blessing needs to go through Jacob. I mean, we don't even know what kind of relationship they had, because all we know the Torah says is that Rivka favored Yaakov. So that leaves me wondering, what was their relationship? Did they have a relationship? What was that like? And then to the point about the compassion, what kind of compassion does Rivka have, if any? It's interesting because Rivka says to Jacob, your brother is planning to kill you. Get out of here. Go to my brother. Go to my father's house. And find a wife there. Rather than saying, yeah, your brother is in deep distress. You have now not only gotten the Bechorah, the birthright, but also you've gotten the blessing. So there's so many questions there. And what does it mean for Rivka also that she will likely never see her son again, because her death is not mentioned directly in Torah? What does that mean for her? Lots of unanswered questions, and I'd love to take any more comments that emerge in the chat.
Yeah, there are a couple more trickling in. Someone wanted to know why it's assumed that Rebecca was infertile. I find it very interesting that Rebecca did not share with Yitzhak about her experience when she was pregnant. If I'm not mistaken, we don't know of any time that Rebecca and Yitzhak spoke. They seem to have had very different visions for their family. Any comments on that?
Certainly, there doesn't seem to be a lot of communication. In terms of Rivka being infertile, the tradition understands that was for 20 years, which is a lot, and especially in that time period. And also, what's interesting is that though there really isn't dialogue between Rivka and Yitzhak, there does seem to be some kind of connection, because Yitzhak, take this or leave it, Yitzhak does not take any other wives, which is very unique. And they do seem to have very different visions of family. So, there are a lot of, think about it, like Eliezer goes and gets this wife gets Rivka, right, and says, you're going to come with me. She's like, great, I'll go. I'll go. But there isn't well, who is this guy? And what's his deal? And, Eliezer has a lot of wealth with him that he brings directly from Abraham and Yitzhak. But I think you're right to mention that there's so many gaps in communication here. There's so much that was unknown to both of them. And we're seeing that playing out. And we, as contemporary readers and learners and lovers of Torah, are meant to then grapple with all of the implications of that.
I think we mostly covered what's there, Lauren. Oh wait, there's one or two that's John asks, I also wonder about Rivka's communication with God when she is pregnant and in pain. Maybe this shapes her belief that Jacob needs to be elevated over Esav. And Naomi notes that according to one tradition, Rivka was 3 years old when she married Isaac, so it makes sense that she didn't get pregnant for a long time.
Yes, and Naomi, I did mention that Midrash a little bit earlier in our session. Yes, there is that tradition that Rivka was 3. I find that to be a deeply troubling tradition. It is there, and if it is in fact the case, which lo aleinu, God forbid, then yes, it would make sense. I would like to name that is there, name that I find it deeply troubling, and that it's not necessarily the majority tradition, but we do and we ought to name, as you have done, that is very much present. And what does that mean for us to grapple with it? And what does that mean for us when we think about Midrashim, especially because Midrashim were often, particularly in Bereshit Rabbah, which is a very extensive collection of Midrashim on Genesis, were often part of synagogue sermons. And we now understand them to be lots of different things, depending on where you are in terms of your hashkafic approach, in terms of your philosophical approach, theological approach. Folks see them as more or less true, with quotes around the word true. Folks can see them as, very evocative and filling in gaps in the narrative. Or as legends, or as part of oral tradition. There are lots of different ways that we can conceptualize midrash. But I do appreciate, Naomi, that you mentioned that, and that if that is in fact the case, that of course it would be quite some time before Rivka would be able to become pregnant. Though the idea of Isaac marrying a child is deeply, deeply distressing to me, and should be to all of us. And then to John's comment, yes, I think that there is perhaps that idea, right? I mean, maybe Esav was just such a challenge for Rivka that she just naturally favored Yaakov. And that really opens us up to, I think, a really important question for all of us in our day, which is the question of the ways in which we engage in our own favoritism. I notice it in my own life in certain contexts. It's not something that I particularly like or particularly want to be the case, but I notice that it's there. What does that mean, to notice that it's there? And what does it mean for all of us? And what do we learn from Rivka in this moment?
A couple more coming in, Lauren. This one I think you may have addressed previously, but Aaron is raising it again. So if there's more to add, please do. But the question is, why would Rebecca trick Isaac rather than reveal that God told her Esav would serve Jacob? And Sally wants to know about the difference between the blessing that Jacob stole and the birthright that Esav sold. Is there a difference between those two?
I love that question. What is the difference between the bracha and the birthright? So the blessing is something that Isaac directly gives to, theoretically, Esau, and in actuality, Jacob, as really passing the baton, passing down the covenant, passing down this relationship, this lineage, the promise, and all that comes along with the promise. And I think the birthright is more, it's a very fine distinction, because I think the birthright is more about firstborn status, specifically aside from the actual covenant being passed down, although we learn that they are interconnected. Theoretically, I guess they could be separate, where the firstborn immediately inherits everything and is perceived to be the direct heir through the birthright, and the blessing is actually that spiritual passing from father to son. That would be my best rendering. And then to Aaron, to your question earlier, which we did address earlier in the session, why didn't Rebecca say directly to Esau that God said, I have to do this thing? Such an important and critical question. We just don't know. I mean, so many questions about relationship and why was there a lack of communication. I mean, there are tons of gaps that I would love to have filled in that I just don't know.
Yeah, we have a bunch of comments still flowing around on the same question. Someone was inquiring about the difference in the Hebrew words between birthright and blessing, whether there was something we could glean from that, and some clarification that the question that you just addressed again is, why didn't Rivka tell Isaac? Not Esav, but why didn't Rivka tell Isaac?
Why didn't Rivka tell? Thank you for that clarification. Why didn't Rivka tell Isaac? Yeah, again, I feel like my answer is the same. What's going on with the communication? What's happening? We just don't know, right? Such an important question. There have to, I always feel like when we think about communication challenges in our own lives and in the lives of our biblical ancestors, there has to be something going on. When in our own lives, when we don't communicate something important to someone very close to us, in this case, Rivka is not communicating to Isaac, to her spouse. Why not? What is happening? What is she afraid of? You know, I often feel like when we don't communicate, there's often a lot of fear underlying why we are not communicating. And we can only conjecture and guess as to why Rivka did not have that direct conversation with Isaac. We know, as I addressed before, that they never actually speak in the shot of the text. So we don't know. It's a really important question, though, to explore.
And anything on the Hebrew words and their roots and birthright versus blessing?
So bracha comes from the Hebrew root bet resh chaf, which means to bend, and it also is related to the word pool, as in pool, P-O-O-L. It's this like fountain of bracha, and bechorot is coming from the root for firstborn, like the bachor, which can also be thought of as, like, if you think of the word yeshiva bachor, but in terms of the actual roots, there is certainly, I think, that distinction between the two of them. And I would want to triple check the text again to make sure I have that directly correct. But I believe that would be where we would get the distinction.
Mm-hmm. Do we know whether Rivka and Yitzhak spoke the same language? Someone's asking.
You know, there are a lot of things we don't know, put into quotes, that we don't know with absolute certainty. And that is a question we don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think the tradition presumes that they do, but we don't actually have directly the idea that they are speaking the same language.
Mm-hmm. I think we have mostly covered all the questions and comments. I apologize if I missed someone. Please do resurface it if there's a comment or a question that I missed. But I think for the moment, Lauren, we're up to speed.
Ben, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Yeah, so Rivka is one of those characters that I think is so important, and one of our biblical forebears that is such an important messenger for all of us in a lot of different ways. Because one of the many things that I take from Rivka is that we are all complex. One of the things that I love about Torah particularly is that we are heirs to a tradition where we are able to experience the complexity of our ancestors as fact and not something to be ashamed of, as if to say, our ancestors were not saints because we ourselves are not saints. You know, how many of us come from lineages where we have our own challenges, dysfunctions, things that didn't go the way that we would have wanted them to go, choices that we've all made in our lives, any number of those things. And I think that Rivka really illustrates that for us, and really illustrates for us that we are often constrained by circumstance. We are often feeling like we don't have a lot of agency, but we actually have more agency than we think a lot of the time. And that sometimes we have to make really hard decisions, and we make those hard decisions in ways that perhaps we wish we had done differently, but we often don't know that until down the line. We don't know, for example, if years later, Rivka, in her own neshama, in her own soul, in her own mind, thought, yes, I was correct that my son Yaakov needed to have the bracha. Now, Rivka was not at all involved in the selling of the birthright, but needed to have the bracha. But maybe I could have done that differently. Why did I make the choices that I did around having the disguise and having Yaakov go with Esav's clothing on and all of those things, especially when my husband clearly knew that something was off, that the math was not adding up? We don't know. But what we do know, and one of the beautiful spiritual lessons that we can take from Rivka, is that we make choices in the moment with the information that we have available. None of us are able to see into the future. None of us have a crystal ball. All we have is that which we know in the moment. All we have is our past choices that have led us to our present choices, our past ways of thinking that influence perhaps our present ways of thinking. And that is as true of Rivka as it is of all of us. And so we have to honor that Rifka made all of the choices that she did, whether it was marrying Yitzhak, whether it was seeking and asking, Im kein lam zenochi, whether it was saying to Yaakov, you better go and get a wife from my brother's house, from my father's house. All of those choices that she made were coming from a place of knowing in her soul that decisions were correct, in her mind, with the information that she had. And we as learners and readers now have the opportunity to lidrosh, to darash, to seek, to search, to have our own perspective. And as with everything, Rivka is a multifaceted person, and we can have lots of different views about her and her choices. Yet she is part of who we all are as Jews. She gives us gifts in lots of ways around expressing ourselves, agency, moving forward boldly. There's a lot there. Result, enthusiasm, holy boldness, lots of different things. And I want to leave us with all of that. And as we move into next week, where we're going to be talking about Leah and Rachel, and we're going to be also talking about Bilhah and Zilpah, to bear in mind that not only are all of our matriarchs related biologically, but all of our matriarchs have that spiritual continuity as well. And that just as we take gifts from Sarah, who we talked about last week, and just as we take gifts from Rifka, so too are we going to learn a lot about how all of that continues with Leah and Rachel. And we're going to explore a little bit of what it means to think about Bilhah and Zilpah in this larger mix as well. And I know we are almost at time, so I'm going to pause now if there are any remaining questions or comments.
Yeah, there is one. I'm sorry I missed this one earlier, but there was a question about how one can tell these stories to children, given that they are so replete with deception, rejection, unkindness, and the like.
Yeah, that is the $100,000 question. How do we tell these stories to children? I think that we focus on the larger. I think that we have to do it in a very age-appropriate way, first of all, and that I would perhaps, rather than going to the details and really recounting them, I would perhaps talk about, who are our imahot, who are our mothers? Well, Rebecca, she was the wife of Isaac, and she had Jacob and Esau, and she was really involved in making sure that Jacob got the blessing that was really important, because if Jacob didn't get that blessing, then we wouldn't be here today. And then as kids get older, really complicating that. Securing kids in their identity as, people make a lot of different choices in their lives. And as they get older, helping to complicate. And I think that that is actually really important, because sometimes what I have noticed in my own work as an educator, if we do not complicate stories we tell to children, when they find out that things are much more complicated as adults, it can be extremely destabilizing. If we are, l'chachila, from the very outset, complicating stories for kids, but doing so in an appropriate and age appropriate way and comprehension level appropriate way, if we are in fact doing that, we can create a much more stable and secure adult foundation, which can then allow us to grapple with competing and complementary narratives as adults much more in a balanced way, I would say, and with much greater equanimity. And I think that is another lesson actually that Rifka gives us. And we can end on that note, that is another lesson that Rifka gives us, that complicating and competing narratives always exist. We often cannot combine them into a single whole, and that's okay. But that when we teach and we learn them together, we learn that the world is complex and that not everything is binary and easy to categorize. And yet we live in a deeply complex world. And that is something that Rifka certainly lived in, and that is something that we live in ourselves.